Okay, we're recording, Mike. Good to see you again.
And you, Tsen, how are you today?
Fantastic, thank you. The sun has been shining, so all is good.
That's always good, yeah.
So today, everyone who's listening and watching this, Mike and I are recording a conversation under the headline of how to build a house that achieves a 75% reduction in space heating requirements. And this is something that I'm sure most people are going to want to learn about, regardless of whether you are building a home now, but you may be looking to be doing development in the future for self or for a project, because everyone wants to save a bit of money on their energy costs. So I can't wait to find out more about this. I'm pretty green and naive, green behind the ears rather than green energy terms, green behind the ears in terms of my understanding. So I can't wait to find out more about this myself. So let's get into a bit about what's going to happen and what people can expect. So before we do a quick intro to yourself, Mike, right at the beginning, because we're going to be chatting for 20 or 30 minutes, what might people expect to get from watching the recording of this conversation?
Well, I think what they'll get is that they should be certainly considering when they're building a house to build it as thermal efficient as they possibly can and reduce what the running costs are. And in effect, you get one chance to do that cost effectively, and that's day one when you're actually building the house. So it's more than possible to reduce what your energy costs are by 75% plus. So, bearing in mind that fuel costs generally double in value over every 10 years, the payback can be considerable. So you want to be building it as thermal efficient as you can day one.
So what we're going to do, I guess, is cover a lot of questions that will help people understand how to achieve that. And so the way the next 20, 30 minutes will pan out is that we'll hear a little bit about Mike's background and why listen to Mike on this topic. And then what I've done prior to this is put the question out on Facebook. What questions would you have for this session I'm going to have with Mike? What questions would you ask to learn more about the passive house standards and how to achieve it? So we've collected a number of questions. There's maybe 10 to a dozen questions, which I'm literally going to read through as they've been sent in so that Mike can respond to those questions. We'll make sure we cover off exactly how to actually build a house that achieves 75% reduction in heating requirements, and literally close it off at that, in the hope of sharing insight and knowledge which can help people go on and pursue this to as far as they want to take it. And I'm going to learn a heck of a lot doing it, so appreciate you sharing your knowledge, Mike. And it may be applicable to a project that Chris and I are looking at the moment as well. So I'm going to be taking notes. We've got a development site we've just completed on, and we'll be looking at how we can optimize that site and type of building. So it's very relevant to me personally too.
Good.
So
Good.
A quick intro to yourself, Mike, in a minute or two. What could you share with everyone watching this to help them understand a bit about your background and how it relates to giving advice on passive house?
Okay. Well, I've been in the construction sector principally really since I left school. So that's, in excess of 40 years, as the grey hairs would kind of testify. I won't bore you with my early career, but really latterly I was the sales director for Scott Frame Timber Engineering, who are the major supplier of timber frame to the self-build market. So over the years, I've helped literally thousands of self-builders achieve their dream of self-building. Now at Scott Frame, we realized, very early on that energy costs and reduction in fossil fuels, and in order to address the global warming issue, was a huge thing. So we invested heavily in developing closed panel insulation, whereby the insulation is fitted in the factory and comes on site with the insulation already fitted, and very airtight and very thermally efficient. So I have literally been involved with projects whereby the buildings have been so thermally efficient that they don't require a central heating system. Now that a lot of people would raise their eyebrows and say, well, that's not possible in Scotland, but it is, and we've done it. We did it in the borders of Scotland. So as I said earlier, really you get one chance to do it cost effectively, and that's when you're building it from day one. So very quickly, that's probably, kind of covers where I feel I'm kind of qualified to offer advice, advice on passive house.
Fantastic. Because my basic understanding of passive house in a few words, if I was to sum it up in essence, it's, I guess, a combination of a number of components or elements in the way the house is put together that results in the house not requiring a heating system or an air conditioning system if it were, say, in a hot climate. That's in simple terms, right?
Yeah.
So it's achieving that.
There are really 5 core principles to passive house, and one is to build it as airtight as you possibly can. There's no point in building a house that is very thermally efficient if you're losing all the air through uncontrolled ventilation, or what most people would refer to as draughts. You also need to have high levels of thermal insulation to keep the heat that you've paid for in the house, so it's not escaping. You need to have high thermal performance windows and doors for the same reason, because that's part of the actual fabric of the house. And then another thing is you need to have as minimal thermal bridging as is possible, which is getting a wee bit technical, but it's, on every fabric there's a kind of weak point, and that's where the heat will find its way to that weak point and actually escape through there. So you address that. And the other thing is ventilation. Obviously, because you're building an airtight house, you need to introduce fresh air, and that would generally be by providing a mechanical ventilation heat recovery system, so that it's actually, the moisture-laden air that you're extracting pre-warms the cold, fresh air that's coming in, so you're not having to heat it right from very cold levels, because it's already the warm air that's been in the house, but it's just it's escaping, so you're taking the heat from that.
Got you. Nicely summarized. So there's the first bit of learning for everyone. 5 main principles to go by. So let's dive straight into the questions then, shall we? The first question I've got is from Kate, which is, how do the build costs compare to a standard build?
Right. It does depend on on a number of things. Obviously, it depends on the size of the house, the complexity of the house, where in the country it actually is, and what specification the house is. But there was a study done, and the prices varied from 2% to 17%, but it averaged out at about 8% more than what a standard construction would be, is what the average is. But you've really got to kind of offset that by what will you actually gain from that, because there's obviously a payback. Well, what you'll gain is in reduced energy costs. Now, for a standard house, on average, it would be somewhere in the region of about £1,440 per year, for the energy cost for that house. If you were building exactly the same house, but you're building it to passive house standards, that 1,440 reduces to £360. So for each year, you have a saving of just over £1,000, £1,080.
Okay.
So that's giving you kind of payback. So that in effect, and you're getting the benefit of that for the lifetime of the house. And of course, every time the energy costs go up, then that benefit increases.
Okay.
So that's what the payback. So it costs you more to build initially, but then the payback is for the lifetime of the house.
Okay, brilliant. So I've already made these 2 notes. I love figures and evidence. So 8% on average, higher build cost, and one can then look at doing a sum themselves to say, okay, depending on how much the property might be have cost more at the end of the day, if we're saving roughly £1,000 per year in heating for 10 years, £10,000, how does that equate to the increase in cost as a proportion?
Additional cost, exactly. Payback, yeah.
So the second, say again, Mike?
Another thing you do get is obviously a very comfortable living environment.
Yes.
Which, so in terms of lifestyle, it, helps with that. So you don't have any cold spots in the house. It's a more even heat throughout the house.
And as everyone knows who lives in Scotland and in most parts of the UK, where you do have many months of almost winter, that
Yeah.
it can be more uncomfortable in those months and you're cranking heating up. And so I guess what value would we attach to having a comfortable house all year long? That's hard to put an actual figure to, because it's a personal thing.
Depends on your lifestyle, depends on the way people are, etc., etc. But yes, the overall, that is certainly, people find the gain of it, and they say, because you've got mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, there's less dust flying about the house as well. So if anybody's got, asthmatic or breathing difficulties, you actually get an added benefit from that, because it's not, with convection heating, quite often there's a lot of dust flying about, whereas you get mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, it's actually filtered air, so it is a cleaner environment you're actually living in.
Fantastic. There's something I didn't know before this chat. Okay. Yeah. The follow-up point that Kate had as her question was, if it is more, so okay, now we know it's roughly 8% more on average to build, are the costs passed on in the value of the end house typically? What's the kind of statistics on that side of things?
Well, it's funny, it's something that actually our ICS, who carry out the valuations for mortgage companies, are actually looking at the moment, because they give scant regard to it, other than maybe the energy performance certificate gives them an indication as to how thermally efficient and what the energy costs are, running costs are for that particular house. But I think there's no doubt that as this whole topic in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions and the whole global warming thing, it will come to the stage whereby that will be one of the things that will add value to a house. So if you had two exactly the same houses on the street, and one was built to passive house standard and one was built to building regulation standard, then it would follow that the one that has been built to passive house should attract a higher selling price, because it is more thermal efficient, it's cheaper to run, it's addressing the whole global warming issue, which we are all faced, for this generation, for our future generations. I mean, who would have thought, in terms of cars, next 5-10 years, we'll all be driving electric cars. And so that's moved on, and construction will be exactly the same.
So there aren't yet enough data to show the end value of passive house standard buildings compared to traditional in terms of values.
No, as I say, the ICS are actually looking at that and trying to come up with some sort of guidance for their surveyors that said, that would actually say, well, yeah, okay, if that house performs to a certain standard, then that should attract a premium in terms of its value.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully on the not too distant horizon for that.
I think undoubtedly that will come.
Cool. That will come. Okay, so now some different questions from Fleur. Her first question is asking if windows can be opened.
Yes, it's funny. It's one of these urban myths. People think you're a passive house, you can't actually open the windows. You can. In fact, they encourage having one opening window or door, in each room, because there are times where you want to be taking the outside into the house, if you like. So if you've got bifold doors, you can open them up and have a nice open aspect. So there's certainly no problem with that. Another thing you can do, you don't have to open windows. You can actually boost the mechanical ventilation heat recovery system a bit, and that will purge the air that you've got. But in situations where you maybe have parties in a house or whatever, then there's no problem in opening up windows and doors. Not an issue at all.
Okay, nice and easy with that one. Does the house need a specific layout, room size, open plan, separate room, closed off to work?
Not necessarily. I mean, there are some basic principles you have to follow, and one of them is that you would try and maximize the solar gain that you get from the sun. So, for example, you'd maybe have a lot more windows on the south elevation than you would have in the north elevation, because that's going to generate free heat. Now, there is a balance there, because you don't want to have it too much such that it overheats. But again, in terms of, from passive house principle, is that irrespective whether it's cold or warm, it regulates the temperature in both situations. So, it saves energy in terms of heating the house, but it also saves energy in terms of cooling the house as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because in some environments, you know, warm countries, heating it is not the problem. Keeping it cool is the problem.
Yeah.
So, you know, in terms of air conditioning costs can be pretty excessive. So, you know, in terms of energy costs, it relates the same to energy costs, whether it's heating it or whether it's cooling it. So
well, this is where I think of immediate examples. I have family members living in two extreme climates, Dubai and in Australia. And so both those places, I know neither of them live in passive houses. So when they're in the heat of summer, where it could be 40 degrees plus in Celsius, their homes can be incredibly hot and unbearable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whereas passive house would
address that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's both extremes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So running costs for comparison, Fleur asked, you covered off, you've offered that up right out the gates, which is really helpful with the saving of roughly £1,000 per year. The next question from her is it possible to install the system in an existing building?
Yes, you can have a passive house in existing building. Now it's a slightly different because quite often, you know, there are limitations in what the building existing structure is. It could be a listed building. You know, you can't go away and start, you know, replacing the walls or whatever. So there is another calculation that's actually done, which is slightly less onerous than full passive house. And that actually, for space heating, for example, rather than 15 kilowatts per hour, you know, per hour, per meter square per year, actually you can have up to 25. And it's the same with the cooling. Again, it goes from 15 to 25, and the air tightness goes from 0.6 if it's a new build, and that increases to 1. So that doesn't perform quite as well.
Okay.
But for the built environment, that can be achievable. But there's no doubt that, you know, an existing building is a lot more difficult to get to passive house standard than when you're building new. It's a lot more challenging. There's no question of that. And as a result, would generally be a lot more expensive as well, because a lot of these old Victorian houses, you know, in terms of, there was no insulation at all in the external walls. In terms of air tightness, well, that wasn't even considered. You know, suspended timber floors, open chimneys, sash encased windows. You know, basically, you know, you can kind of stand two meters back and you can feel the draft from the window. So all these things would have to be addressed in order to make it come anywhere close to achieving passive house.
So here's an additional kind of naive question from me, just adding to this when you mention it. What is the secret to achieving air tightness?
It's just basically closing off all the gaps. So anywhere where air can escape to the outside, because obviously, you know, warm air only moves to cold air. So if it's the same temperature inside and out, then you get no movement. But whenever you've got a differential in temperature, be that warm outside and colder inside, then the warm will try and get to the inside. And conversely, if it's cold outside and warm inside, the warm will try to go to the cold bit. So, and part of that is how actually the airflow from that. So, like ventilation around windows and doors, you know, perimeter windows and doors at the junction of the floor and the ceiling. The floor and the walls, and between the ceiling and the actual walls, and you know, where the plumber punched a great big hole through the floor just to put his waste pipe and all these things, and even round to putting grommets round about the electrics where they go into the socket. All these things add to making it airtight. And that can be, there's a wee, you know, you get a smoke detector, a smoke stick, and you can actually show that, and it will show you where the smoke laden air is actually going, so you can then seal that, and that would, you know, that would help.
I see.
So that's basically how you make it as airtight as you possibly
that's it. Can. So in short, yes, it is possible to kind of retrofit the principles to an old house, but maybe not the standards to meet certification. That's going to be a much harder thing to achieve with an existing house.
Yeah, you can I mean, it can, it can be done, but you're going to have to, throw a fair bit more money to it.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine these older buildings, as I say, there'll be a lot of work in getting it, up to kind of passive house.
Yeah.
Not impossible, but pretty challenging.
Okay. The next one from Fleur was, how deep does the heat exchanger need to be?
Well, I'm presuming by heat exchanger, which actually means if she's talking about a ground source heat pump. So, because generally, if you're putting a ground source heat pump, there's two ways of actually installing that. One is what they call with slinkies, which in effect is just a pipe that's buried in the ground, and that requires a fair area of ground in order to have that, because once you go down, there's like 8 feet, for example, the temperature in the ground doesn't vary throughout the year. Now, a lot of people wouldn't go down to 8 feet, but if you do that, then you'll get a more efficient system.
Okay.
But a lot of them actually only put them down 1.2 meters, obviously have to be below the kind of frost line. So 1.2 meters, which is about 4 feet, would be fairly common. But if you can go deeper than that, then certainly you will get more efficiencies in the system. And 8 feet, 2.4, but so that's one way, with the slinky, what they call slinkies. The other way is you actually drill holes. So you actually get a drilling rig on site and you actually drill holes, and that maybe go down 70 meters.
Wow.
Obviously, as the core of the earth is warm, the further down you go, the more heat you can garner from that. And maybe for a 3 or 4 bedroomed house, you may be talking about 3 or 4 kind of piles, if you like it. You would have to sink in order to benefit from that heat. But that means you don't require the same area of ground, because that can be done in a lot more condensed an area than the slinkies, because you're obviously going vertically rather than horizontally. That's
interesting, because this feeds into the latter questions that Fleur asked, which are to do with the size, the space needed. She asked about, could it be in the garden next to the building? So I guess you've answered, if there's limited space, the solution has to be going deep. If there's plenty of space in the garden, what kind of square meterage or footage of a garden space is needed to lay out the slinkies in a more shallow depth?
Very, very much depends on the size, on the actual size of the house. So that would be a difficult one, but you're going to require if you like, if I put it in terms of a large garden in order to accommodate that. So the typical developer garden wouldn't achieve it. You would have to have something that has got a pretty generous garden on it in order to achieve that. If that, as I say, because you can't be specific, because it very much depends on the house. Okay,
but it gives us an idea, and I'm guessing that going 70 meters deep with the drill is going to be significantly more expensive than going shallow.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's more expensive, because obviously you get a drilling rig and you're, as I said, a drill down. Whereas, a typical digger JCB can easily, track out for the trenches.
Yeah.
And you can actually, you could lay the slinkies yourself if you like. You could do it on a DIY basis. Whereas if you're going vertically, then actually not something that the DIYer could actually do.
Yeah, specialist stuff. Okay, fascinating. So we're probably maybe a bit over halfway through the questions.
Okay.
A bit of context to this one. So this one from Martin, he's saying that as Scotland moved towards a new build heat standard in 2024, and probably highly likely to stop combustion heating, also referenced the Welsh government recently announcing the ban on fossil fuels in some buildings. He asks, will passive house standards be used to offset this, or are these standards too expensive for mainstream house builders to deploy across their projects? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a big one. I think what I would say is that Scotland, the Scottish government have aims to be, one of, if not the leader in terms of this whole carbon emissions. So they're actually saying, they have a paper out at the moment, out for consultation, but their suggestion is that from 2024, heating systems in new build will not be allowed to have, they'll have to have, you know, zero emissions. Now that's quite a challenge. Obviously, in terms of even new build, they're generally saying you won't be able to put in gas-fired boilers. The idea is you're not going to be able to burn fossil fuels for heating.
Yeah.
So Scotland, you know, they say they want to be a world leader in that. They're out for consultation at the moment, but it is something that they will not be discouraged from implementing. They are definitely going down that route, and we will. They will legislate by regulation, and that will mean that everybody, including the major house builders, will have to toe the line. And they generally only toe the line is when the regulations are actually put in place.
Right.
That undoubtedly is going to happen. So you know, you're going to have to, I mean, what we're going to have to do in order to achieve the goals that they're looking for is a 75% reduction by 2030 from, you know, from current day. Now that's a big jump, and that's going to require a lot of you know, a lot of input from, you know, from builders, developers in order to achieve that. But the Scottish government are not going to be shifted from that stance.
I can imagine there's going to be a huge amount of resistance from our utilities companies who clearly are not going to want homes to be so efficient that it's saving so much per year, because then they are no longer going to be making the same revenue from all households.
Well, yeah, there is an element of that, but you know, if you look at a lot of the major suppliers, the BP, the Shells, and all that, they're actually investing very, very heavily in renewable technologies. They recognise that oil and gas is not going to be the future. They're looking at renewable technologies and spending vast amount of money in research, you know, kind of research on that. So, you know, the energy companies are actually changing their tack pretty dramatically. You probably have noticed even on the TV, you know, like so BP advertising, you know, this is our renewable manager, and you'll see acres upon acres of photovoltaic panels generating electricity. And it's quite astounding how it has moved on. But I think it's something like 90%. And there was a survey done in 2019, and something like 90% of the electricity that was generated in Scotland was from renewable sources. Now that's quite a startling figure.
Yeah, that is.
You know, when you bear in mind. So that's why you see all these wind farms all over the place. There's obviously, you know, hydropower, wind power has been researched. Sorry, not wind power. Wave power has been researched a lot as well, because obviously we're, as an island, we're surrounded with waters and pretty choppy waters, and obviously if that wave power can be harnessed, then again we have a renewable
absolutely
energy source. So that's again a huge amount of research and development going on there for that.
Great. So it's looking like everyone's getting pretty much on the same page. It's just taking time. So exactly. I think that does answer the in time yes to Martin's question. House builders will need to adopt these standards. How the costs are going to work with that and the end values, etc. That's to be figured out.
The thing is, the more that this technology is actually used, then the unit price will start dropping as well, because obviously, you know, it's a case of it's like, I suppose, like everything, you know, the more that something is produced, then the unit cost can actually reduce accordingly. So it'll be exactly the same for, you know, for all these technologies. They're all will be expensive for a start, but then the price point will reduce as it becomes more the norm to install them, because more and more people will be installing them.
Yeah.
So there's obviously savings by quantities, you know, from that point.
Naturally. Yeah. That absolutely makes sense. He then goes on to ask, will these standards make builds more complex, as we find some developers struggle with traditional standards? So I guess talking about that transition, making builds more complex. And actually, I'll ask this next question for you to answer them both together, because it ties in. He says, are these standards being built into apprenticeship frameworks and standards, or are they still quite specialist, requiring upskilling of the workforce? So what he's pointing to are challenges for developers, house builders, and I guess the construction staff that they are working with.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, is it more complex? Well, it doesn't have to be more complex. It's just a bit more attention to, to detail in a lot of situations, because a lot of it will be designed within the architect's office. And it's just how that design is actually implemented on site. I mean, we're already seeing that colleges and the like are actually starting up courses and making, their apprentices or their students more aware of the importance of reducing fossil fuel use, of building houses, or not just houses, actually buildings, because another thing I should mention is passive house is not just tied to houses, it's any type of building. I mean, we supplied a children's nursery, which was, to passive house standards. So it can apply to any building. It's not necessarily just the domestic buildings. But yes, undoubtedly, as this becomes more and more the norm way of actually building, then all the colleges and all of that will be training that as part and parcel. So there will be, education right from apprenticeship level all the way through on all levels within the construction sector. That's undoubtedly, and that's already happening.
It's already happening. Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Is there a leading light in that space in the country, setting the example somewhere in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland? That's
well, in Scotland here, we have the Construction Innovation Centre, which is based, is based here. It's actually based in Hamilton. So they're looking at modern methods of construction, doing various tests all the time. So there are, Scotland, in all honesty, has been one of the leaders, worldwide on building low energy homes. And I always remember talking to an architect at an exhibition and saying, "Oh, I'm just back from Germany. We were across there looking at, very thermally efficient houses," because the passive house actually originated in Germany back in 1990. So this is about 30 years old, this thing. So, and I said, "Why did you go to Germany?" "Well, because we can't supply them to that level, level in this country." And I said, "Well, with all due respect to you, I could take it to a factory 20 minutes from here that are actually supplying to a better standard than that." And that was when I was with Scotland. We were supplying to a standard that was better than what they were doing across in Germany. So, it's a bit of a misnomer that we're behind the ball here. In actual fact, in many situations, we're actually ahead of the game.
Good to know. Okay. We're down to the last couple of questions. So from Clive, he's asking, how is passive house viewed by lenders? He said it is by default non-standard. And of course, it's a standard that should be encouraged. You touched on it a bit earlier on, but would be anything else you'd add to your earlier point about how passive house homes are being viewed by lenders?
Yeah, I think maybe where he's coming from here is that sometimes lenders get a bit nervous if it's a non-standard construction that is not kind of recognized as kind of mainstream. But passive house can be built using standard construction techniques. It's just that it's maybe taken to a slightly different level in terms of air tightness and thermal performance. But the construction can be exactly the same. So it shouldn't be classed as non-standard, because it's not just down to the construction. There are other elements that come into play with the passive house that we mentioned. Air tightness, mechanical ventilation, heat recovery. So, from that point of view, it should make no difference at all to lenders. You should get lending for a passive house, no problem at all. Another thing to bear in mind is it should give them a bit of comfort, because the homeowner is going to be spending less on energy costs. So it means that they could actually afford to pay the mortgage a bit easier, or maybe even build a larger house day one, because they're not going to be spending it on energy costs. They can put it towards a bigger mortgage for a bigger house. Yeah, that makes sense.
That sounds like it's a spreadsheet task. Look at the 10, 15-year picture and beyond. Exactly. Okay, his final question. Let's see where this one's going. Maybe not directly related, but good to get your view on it. He's talking about adding solar collectors over a brand new roof. Not the biggest fan of that. He says in the US, Tesla are starting to produce a roof tile that is a collector. Are you aware of any similar products in the UK? it would be a massive breakthrough if a whole south facing roof was a solar collector.
Yeah, yeah. I know there are actually, I'm aware that obviously Tesla are, well, in America, they actually have these tiles which are solar collectors. In effect, like rather than have the big photovoltaic panels that you see in a lot of roofs that a lot of people don't like the aesthetics of, then there was solar tiles actually invented. But yes, there is actually in the UK, I think there's a company in Wales actually produce them. And I know that Tesla, well, they were supposed to be introducing them into the UK in 2019, but that hasn't happened. But I think it's on the cusp of actually arriving in the UK here, the Tesla tiles. Having said that, they are expensive. They will, in effect, pretty much double the cost from fitting photovoltaic panels to fitting tiles that have that photovoltaics in them. So it is an expensive way of doing it.
Okay.
And okay, so then you've got the balance between, what the aesthetics are and what the costs are, and that's obviously very much a personal decision.
Yeah, got you. Okay, fantastic. Well, these were all the questions that came in from the social media peeps. So thanks so much for answering those. I hope that's going to be satisfactory for everyone asked the questions in the first place. I've certainly learned a huge amount myself. I've got another basic question for you.
Yeah.
Because you've got, say, the ground source heat pump or an alternative mechanical.
You can have air source heat pump as well. It doesn't have to be a ground source. You can have air source as well.
What's the ability like of those to get the really hot bath water, hot shower water? Are they still able to be burning? Obviously, we know that traditional oil and gas boilers can produce that kind of hot water for Scottish houses in the winter.
Yeah.
Again, as I say, very simple question for my own curiosity for in the passive house. If you're spending minimal on heat, because the house can, I believe, use heat from your windows, body heat off your appliances to keep the temperature warm. How do you get your water really hot without it costing much?
Yeah, well, that's where obviously the heat pumps can generate heat for that, but you can also generate, if you put photovoltaics on the roof, for example, generate electricity, then that can in effect power, in effect, a glorified immersion heater, if you like. So when it's warm outside, you could be generating, and you would have a heat store, which in effect is a fancy kind of word for a hot water cylinder, but it's a lot more efficient than the old copper hot water cylinders. They're very well insulated, and you can get, so they can heat various elements of the actual tank. And that, because once you've reduced the energy cost involved in heating the house, then your next big challenge is obviously in your domestic hot water. And that's how exactly you would address that, by trying to use the free electric that's generated from your solar, from your solar panels to heat the water. And then it's contained in a heat store, and then you draw it off as and when you actually require.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. So if we circle back then to what we started out looking to achieve, which was sharing how to build a house that achieves 75% reduction in space heating requirements. We've touched on, I'd say, elements of it, but the mic is yours, Mike, to add what else you would to help answer that question for people who are really curious. Well, how can I achieve that?
Well, I think, certainly, I'm open to, having a chat with anybody on it. I actually run a self-build course, which takes people through the whole process of self-building. A lot of people would love to self-build, but are just a bit scared of the process, and maybe have watched Grand Designs, which can be very stimulating in terms of, I would love to self-build, but then scares them off when they see all the problems. But of course, that makes good TV, and a lot of the problems I see on Grand Designs are pretty basic schoolboy errors that, by course, you would avoid all these errors because there is a process to follow. So I can help people, I've got the course, I can offer a consultancy, so however many hours they want to engage me for. or I can do a full project management. If I'd say, well, look, I just want you to come and just organize for the contractors and organize everything for me. Then I can do a project management, full project management service, kind of service for them. And obviously, one of the first things I'd be chatting about is how far do I want to go? Do I want to go to Passive House Principles, or do I want to go to full Passive House Certified? Because that's the other thing, is you don't have to necessarily go to the full certification to have the certificate on the wall, because that kind of costs a bit of money, but you can still build the Passive House Principles. So if you adopt most of the principles, you're going to be a kick in the backside away from full passive house, but just not have the certificate on the wall. So that, to be honest, that's what a lot of people actually do. So as I say, I can help.
And by putting in place the 5 principles, that's what's going to get your heating expense down by 75% or a bit more.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah. So it's really a lot of it's just attention to detail on site. Basically, the design of the house, the construction of the house in terms of what principles you're actually using, what construction method you're using, all these parts, can have a part to play. So they all interlink. So it's important they're all looked at the very early stages in a design in order to maximize your chances of building a house that will comply with all the Passive House Principles.
Brilliant. Final question from me is, would you say there's any one of those 5 components that have the highest input to influencing the reduction in heat cost?
Yeah, the best bangs for your buck, if that's really the question asking for me, is to make the fabric of the house. And when I'm talking about the fabric, I'm talking about the floor, the walls, the roof, and the windows and doors. Make them as thermally efficient as you can.
Right.
That would be your first focus, because that's going to give you the best, the most benefit. Then followed by making it as airtight as you possibly can. So that's the 2 ones that you would really zero in on and make sure you get them right, because that's the ones that, as I say, are going to deliver best bangs for your buck.
Great. Well,
it's quite interesting on that. Just to maybe just mention, there was a challenge done in Glasgow. They called it the Icebox Challenge that Passive House actually ran. And what it was, they built 2 houses, or miniature houses, basically almost like a glorified garden shed. One was built to current building regulation standards, and one was built to Passive House standard. What they did was they put in a cubic meter of ice. So if you can imagine a big ice cube, meter by a meter by a meter, which was about 1,917 kilograms, I understand. And they put one in each of the 2 boxes and closed the doors. And then the idea was that they were going to leave them there and see which one, maintained the ice for as long as it possibly could, on the basis that it was going to, keep the ice. It wasn't going to overheat, because this was done, I think it was August last year, where we had a bit of a heat wave. So what actually happened is, the idea was that they would open the doors after a fortnight just to see. But actually, the one whereby the standard house that were built under the building regulations, they opened the box. It was after 9 days, the ice in the Scottish standard built house had actually entirely melted. It had disappeared completely. So that was 9 days before the fortnight, before the fortnight was up. They then left the Passive House one, and when they opened the doors for that one, there was still 121 kilograms of ice there. So it was 13% of the ice was still sitting in it. So that was a pretty graphic display as to how the Passive House had performed in comparison to a building regulation standard house. Now, bear in mind that most houses are not built to current building regulation standards. So houses that were built maybe 60s, 70s, 80s wouldn't be nowhere near that standard.
Yeah.
So the ice would have melted after a couple of days.
Yeah, exactly. That's nice. I like that. So really
interesting. I thought it was a very interesting
visual example.
It was very tangible in terms of looking at it,
Yeah, that's brilliant. I like that. Well, that's a nice visual note to wrap up on. And There's a few ways you mentioned you can be of service to people who might want some further assistance or ask further questions. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you, Mike?
Best way is contact me through the email, and if you contact me at the office at self-buildsuccess.co.uk, and if you email there and just ask whatever question it is, and we can have a further chat from there. So
Perfect.
That's office at self-buildsuccess.co.uk, and as I say, we would get back to you quickly from there and have an informal chat and just see if there's anything that I could help, can help you with.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Mike. I think we've largely done it, maybe around the half-hour mark. And
perfect. That's good. That's good.
I've learned a load, and I'll certainly be asking for some of your guidance on our new build that's coming up. And we'll look forward to catching up again very soon.
Okay, that's fine.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks so much for the opportunity. Thank you now. Bye.
Bye, everyone.